Hi, everyone. I elected to break up episode 15 into two parts. So this is part two of the episode, Could Gray Have Seen Kierkegaard as a Brilliant and Brave Anti-Paulinist? So please enjoy, and it's going to start abruptly in the middle of thought that was in the last episode. All right. So again, just remember these are heroic statements. He's putting his whole life out there for everybody to understand that he is he's an opponent of what everybody else believes is normal, let's go to church this Sunday kind of lifestyle. He's just saying it's all on the wrong upside down. So here's what he's going to say about it further. Cover up by artifice that this mitigation of Christianity, Paulinism, is abandoned Christ. So basically, he's not going to say people covered this up. They're deliberately concealing what's happening. And okay, so let's hear what he says. Now this is in Kierkegaard. What do I want? 1855 in the Essential Kierkegaard, Princeton University Press, 2000 at page 429. I want to have the mitigation that is current Christianity here in this country set alongside the New Testament in order to see how these two relate to each other. So now he's saying, hey, let's look at the Christianity of today. It's a mitigation of it, meaning less than what it should be, and the New Testament. If I or anyone else can show it can be maintained face to face with the Christianity of the New Testament, then I will accept it with the greatest joy. So he's saying, if you could show me it's the same thing as what Christ taught, I'd be thrilled. I'd be like overjoyed. But one thing I do not want at any price. I do not want to create by suppression or artifice the appearance that the current Christianity in this country and the Christianity of the New Testament resemble each other. The extreme mitigation of Christianity of the New Testament cannot possibly hold good when every artifice has been used to cover up the difference between the Christianity of the New Testament and this mitigation. So it's just saying is people have put on false images to make us think that we are living in a New Testament-like world, meaning what Jesus portrayed we should live like, because we're not living anything like it. But we all put on as if we are living like Christ told us to live. All right, let's look at the next quote. My heading for this is, I hold up Christ as paramount to beat down the sophistic found in Paul's teachings that consumes Christianity. So here he's back to criticizing Paul again. He had moved to Luther. He then criticized all of us for putting on an artifice, and now he's going to come back to the problem child, Paul. And this is in Kierkegaard's Attack Upon Christendom, 1854 to 1855, translated by Lowry, Princeton, 72, page 283. And this was originally part of the work My Task, September 1, 1855. And so let's listen to this. Inasmuch as I have made a critical comment upon the apostle, the following is to be noted. I am entirely within my rights, for the apostle Paul is only a man. If in the teaching of the apostle Paul there is found even the slightest degree anything that can be related to what in the course of centuries has become the sophistic, which consumes all of Christianity, I must raise an outcry, lest the sophists appeal to the apostle. It is of great importance, especially in Protestantism, to straighten out the prodigious confusion Luther has brought about by inverting the relationship and in effect criticizing Christ by Paul, the master, by the disciple. What I have done is to hold up Christ's preaching alongside the preaching of the apostle. So he's saying, I'm not going to preach Paul alone. I'm going to preach Christ. And he's going to preach Paul. But I'm never going to preach Paul alone. I'm going to always preach Christ. And he sees sophistry, which means slick, crafty arguments in Paul. And of course, he's not going to preach any of that. Okay, next quote. He says, this is my heading, challenge is to restore true Christianity. If anything is to be done, one must try to introduce Christianity into Christendom. He's saying we're in a desperate time. Okay, he's in Denmark. Did I say the Netherlands? I forgot. In Protestantism, especially in Denmark, Christianity marches to a different melody to the tune of Merrily We Roll Along, Roll Along, Roll Along. Christianity is enjoyment of life, tranquilized as neither Jew nor pagan was by the assurance that the thing about eternity is settled precisely in order that we might find pleasure in enjoying this life, as well as any pagan or Jew. He absolutely correct. Kierkegaard, Attack Upon Christendom, 1854, page 35. Yeah, isn't that what this is all about? We believe Christianity, and what we're trying to spread to people is we're trying to spread the formula of saying the right words and believe in the Lord Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Fine. And you believe that he in his death, burial, and resurrection. That's more typically how we all conceive of it. But since we don't know anything about what Jesus teaches, we don't study and become his disciple ourselves, that's about where it begins and ends. Because we don't make anything he teaches of any fundamental importance in our own life. Okay, maybe some people may. And I believe there are a lot that do that. But you are not in the mainstream if you haven't noticed. And so the church doesn't go to great lengths on a weekly basis or in sermon time to teach anything that Jesus teaches. And just so I want to expose this to you, because if you've been in a church and you're saying he can't be right, I'm going to prove it to you. Take out a piece of paper for the next 4 weeks. Go to church with a pad or a piece of paper. Write a line down the middle of it and put Jesus on the left and Paul on the right. And every time there's a quotation of Jesus, just check mark. Put one, how you keep baseball scores or bowling scores, you just put down a mark, and then when you get 5, you cross out a block of them and you have 5, and you keep doing that. Now, my statistics over 5 years, and it was consistent pattern, it was 13 quotes for every of Paul for every one of Jesus. No matter what the sermon topic was, it could have been something that clearly Jesus teaches on. It wouldn't matter. Paul, Jesus. Paul, Jesus. Paul, Jesus. That was it all the time, and you don't see it's happening. It's subtle. And even when they talk about Jesus, they find a way to always come back to Paul anyway. So it's just unbelievable. And he's saying all we're doing is we're just giving people this idea that we're assuring them about eternity is settled, and that's it. So we're all going to have a good time. That's all. It's all for us. It's not about God. God has been, he put it earlier up here. God is what? God has to put up with what we're doing, and we have, what did he say? We've cheated God out of Christianity. Yeah, God has virtually no place. God the Father. Well, nobody talks about him. And so I believe we're talking about Christ because Christ talks about God the Father. But Paul doesn't teach us anything about God the Father. In fact, he seems to be teaching very negatively about God the Father. The Ten Commandments, the law. He says God the Father did not give the law to Moses. Did you know that, ladies and gentlemen? Read Galatians 3. He says it was given to Moses by angels. Moses as a mediator from angels. And then when he gets to the issue of whether they should obey Sabbath or not, he says there, why do you want to get in bondage again to those who are no gods? And he means the angels. Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. And he's saying to them specifically, you don't want to do the Sabbath because that's something angels told you to do, not God. That's not from God. Watch it. Read carefully what he says in Galatians 3. Anyway, I digress again. All right. So now, let's see where we're here. Okay, eternity settled. Protestant ministers teach that eternal blessedness can be bought for a song. Okay, this is what I was trying to tell you. This is where cheap grace comes from. A brilliant transaction. In comparison to what Jesus taught, one can readily see the minister's price is cheap. Okay, so he actually did use the word cheap, but he didn't call it cheap grace yet. That came with Bonhoeffer. A regular selling out price. So he's making it that you get grace for nothing is false, misleading. And then he says exactly the words, almost the same words as Bonhoeffer does in his first chapter of The Cost of Discipleship that he wrote in 1937. So I put the heading, what is called Christianity is a Christianity without Christ. Whoever thou art, whatever in other respects thy life may be, my friend, be ceasing to take part, if ordinarily thou doest, in the public worship of God, as it now is, with the claim that this is the Christianity of the New Testament, thou hast constantly one guilt the less. So by not going to church, you're doing one thing positive for God. You're not putting up with the fraud that's going on in church. Now, I don't know if I would tell people that, because maybe there are some churches that are right, and maybe you go to a church that you feel has got its head on straight. But I'm telling you, do the diagnosis. Keep that chart, 13 to 1. Tell me if it's not 13 to 1. Put a little comment. Mine was, 7 to 1 in favor of Paul. But if you could ever find a church that's, 7 to 1 in favor of Jesus, stick there and you're okay, but that would be a miracle to me. Anyway, he's saying, don't go to church. You're just putting up with the fraud. Thou hast constantly one guilt the less, and that a great one, a great sin, great guilt. Thou dost not take part in treating God as a fool by calling that Christianity of the New Testament, which is not Christianity of the New Testament. So this is where he was very strongly saying this is why he won't call himself a Christian, even though you can see he's dynamically trying to lead people to follow Christ, but he won't put up with these frauds. And then I'm going to put some comment here. Kierkegaard was a very key influence on Bonhoeffer. The only key difference is Bonhoeffer never openly criticized the modern emphasis on Paul over Jesus. Bonhoeffer simply ignored Paul when Bonhoeffer summarized the salvation principles applicable to believers in course of discipleships. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all that, but we have more on our good friend here. Now, I want to show you, okay, so I'm going to pause here. I'm going to show you, we're going to talk about what is the reaction to Paulinists, to Kierkegaard. Are they going to be honest and tell you what he really believes, or are they going to cover it up and hide it? Just like he said. What do you think, my friends? What do you think? Do you think Gray was doing any covering up? I mean, come on. Could he, if he read any of this? And see, that's the problem. I can't prove that he read anything because he doesn't quote anything except one little quote. And even that isn't very strong. I showed you some of the real dynamic, strong quotes. So, yeah. Anyway, but I'm going to have some real doozies here. So we're going to change slides and we'll be right back. Okay, so before I read you how what's happened to Kierkegaard in the hands of Paulinists, I just want to tell you. So did you see how in the quote number 1 above, Kierkegaard equated Paulinism, that is predominant Protestantism, with a mitigation of Christianity? Then we saw how Kierkegaard described in number 4 above this same mitigation, without identifying the word Paulinism, as covered up by artifice. So we do not see the difference between New Testament Christianity and this mitigation of Christianity. So therefore, there's no more scathing analysis of Paulinism that can be found from a true theologian than in the writings of Kierkegaard. So sometimes you got to piece it a little bit together. So I want to tell you that, I mean, I see very blunt anti-Paulinism, but sometimes he's talking about mitigation over here, and you got to combine it with another text to understand mitigation means Paulinism, and he defines it that way in one context, but in the next context he doesn't always define it. So there is some aspect of his that you have to combine these statements to get a full grasp on what he's saying. But it's still blunt and it's out there, and you can't deny this guy is an anti-Paulinist, and of the most severe type. I mean, there's no way there's any balancing, any comments he could ever say that can overcome these as being extremely negative comments about Paul. So what happens? Rarely is this aspect of Kierkegaard mentioned. Why do you think that is? Because it's embarrassing. He's a Lutheran theologian, a person who studied in theology school. He came out and he's brilliant. He's brilliant, and he's respected all over the world for his philosophical writings. He's a genius, to be honest. I mean, he's just, and he's a good writer too. In fact, the completely opposite spin now exists because Kierkegaard's works fell into the hands of Paulinists. Can you believe that? Oh, he would turn over in his grave. His enemies are now in charge of his writings. In one edition of his journals, there is a constant footnoting by the editor to confirmation found in the writings of Paul, even though Kierkegaard's habit himself was almost always to quote or cite Jesus. For example, see any mention of Paul in Journals Volume 2 in this edition, and is almost exclusively in the editor's footnote. See this link. So in other words, these Paulinists don't care that that Kierkegaard can't stand Paul and wants Jesus to be emphasized and would quote Jesus in his footnotes. And now these Paulinists come in and just infuse Paul in the footnotes. So you know this is not from Kierkegaard. This is the editors making it sound like what Kierkegaard's saying can all be found in Paul, which, by the way, this is the thing. Paul can talk out of both sides of his mouth, and you just really can't know which way he's going. But you really know where he's going. He's always his favorite theme is faith alone, anti-law, anti-law, faith alone, faith alone, faith alone. Oh, and over here, you can't inherit the kingdom of God. If you've done this sin, that's sin. And then I'm going to drop mentioning that for the next 4 or 5 books, and then I'm going to come back and say you can't inherit the kingdom of God if you do X, Y, and Z. So he has those exceptional moments where he has some standards where you can lose your salvation, and he says, oh, but we have a guaranteed promise in heaven. It can't be broken. It's eternal. So he has inconsistent, incoherent passages that nobody... But if you want to believe you're going to heaven no matter what, and just have to believe some facts, Paul's your man. But anyway, the point is Kierkegaard's been captured by the people he was fighting. Anyway, now you have some honesty. Some specialists concede Kierkegaard turned against Paul's validity. So this is, the editor is Peter Rode, 1990. So this is his statement. S.K. Soren Kierkegaard, ever stricter demands also led him to turn against the Apostle Paul. Wow. That takes a lot of bravery to say. Trust me. 293, and it's in footnote 213. So that's not too bad. It's somewhere. It's not in the opening commentary. It's not in the introduction, but it's somewhere buried in a footnote that he's anti-Paul. In truth, Kierkegaard was very cognizant that his views on Paul would cause sweeping rejection and further isolation of what he had to say. At one point, he says, I stand alone. Kierkegaard's strategy to avoid further isolation was to deny he was a Christian. So if he denies he's a Christian, you can't say, well, you're behaving not like a Christian. He says, I don't want to behave like a Christian. All of you are doing damnable things, and your doctrines are damnable, so don't worry. I don't want to claim I'm a Christian. That was his answer to them. I don't do that. I believe we follow Christ, so I call myself a Christian. But Kierkegaard was clearly a follower of Jesus and a believer. Most recognize him as a Christian theologian of merit. What Kierkegaard meant, he was not a Paulinist, when Paulinism had come to redefine what it meant to be a Christian. This can only be realized when you take quotes, as we did above, and place them together. When you look carefully for the basis of his critique of Protestantism, it was its excessive elevation of Paul and consequent marginalization of Jesus Christ. Kierkegaard was thus the forerunner of the movement we see today, the restoration of Christianity to the one who was the sole teacher and pastor, Jesus Christ, taking all such de facto interference from Paul out of the way. So I see that, my channel, a lot of other people are all heading in the same direction to try to wake up people about Jesus Christ and his priority over anybody else. He's sole pastor, sole teacher. He made that clear. Messiah is supposed to be someone we all looked up to and follow. He's the prophet, which means every word he said is something we have to obey. And God says, and what does he say about the prophet, ladies and gentlemen? In Deuteronomy 18, I'm going to hold to account every person on earth, and he means Jews and non-Jews, to have listened and obeyed the prophet. And in Acts 3, Peter says Jesus was the prophet, and he says those very words again. He says, and God warned, anyone who does not follow what he teaches shall be cast out. Okay, so there is no place for dispensationalism. There is no room for it. Jesus has this exclusive position. You can't dislodge him, and if you try to do that, you're denying him, and you're violating his very words. Let's keep going here. Let's see. Secondary sources on Kierkegaard and Apostle Paul. In Fear and Trembling on the Apostle Paul, Kierkegaard... Oh, this is somebody writing this book. He's commenting on Kierkegaard's work called Fear and Trembling, and there is a mention of Apostle Paul there. He says, Kierkegaard emphatically and repeatedly says there, he, Paul, was without authority. Yes, I've read that, by the way, and it's just one of these weird things where he just constantly says this, but he doesn't explain himself. So he sometimes just doesn't take time to explain everything. So I could show it to you, and it just simply says, Paul speaks without authority and blah, 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 blah. But I'd like him to explain what he means. Why doesn't he have any authority? Is he not an apostle? Do you agree with that? Have you read Tertullian? What's your proof? So he doesn't always articulate everything he says. Then Kierkegaard's attack on cheap grace doctrine, or Pauline doctrine, and he calls it a false Christianity. That's the name of his work. What is Christianity like? Simply to be like Christ. Okay, and so he's going to, everybody just wants to reduce the requirements and so on. Okay, you could read that. There are well-intentioned, half-hearted acts from generation to generation. We are doing just exactly the opposite of what we intend to do. We produce Christians by the millions and are proud of it, yet we have no inkling that we are doing just exactly the opposite of what we intend to do. So we're not really making any Christians of anybody. We're just making people more like ourselves who are not following Christ, following Paul. The New Testament Christianity simply does not exist. Let me just see if I can find anything else. Oh, hold on. I'm going to just check this out and get back to you all. Okay, you know what? Let's take a look at what he's saying, that Christ is always trying to provoke us to have consciousness of sin and therefore repent. Let us look more carefully at what Christ actually says with regard to children, for example. Let the children come to me, and do not forbid them to come to me, for such belongs the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19, verse 14. The whole chapter speaks of the difficulty of entering the kingdom of heaven, and expressions are as strong as possible. There are eunuchs who have castrated themselves. I didn't realize that's the word. I guess in Denmark they give a little more graphic translation. There are eunuchs who have castrated themselves for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. It is no wonder that the disciples become so terrified that they exclaim, "Who can be saved?" See, I mean, if Jesus had an easy gospel, why are the apostles worried that nobody can be saved if we have these standards? How are we going to teach anybody to become a Christian? After Christ answers the disciples, he goes on to speak of the reward awaiting those who have left houses and brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for the sake of his name. All of these teachings are salty expressions depicting the collisions in which a Christian can and will be tested. Consequently, Christ makes entering into God's kingdom as difficult as possible. Well, what happened to this easy believism we're teaching all the time? Christ doesn't have any of these thoughts. But if entering this kingdom is supposed to be about the loveliness and innocence of being a little child, a proper little angel, then what could this possibly mean in the presence of the apostles who were called to pick up their cross and follow? And then he says this, interesting. A childish view of Christianity is ludicrous. If the assertion about being a child must be understood literally, then it is nonsense to preach the cross of Christ to adults. Yet this is the way Christianity is defended by Orthodox fencers. Childlike Christianity, which in a child is lovable, in adult is childish. Faith such as that confuses everything. That's a difficult expression. I think he means such faith confuses everything. If a little child, literally understood, is to provide the definition of what Christianity is, then there is no terror. It ceases to be an offense, as the Apostle Paul says, to the Jews and foolishness to Christ. One best becomes a Christian without Christianity. I think what he's saying is that even though Jesus is being easy towards children, let them come to me, he has other standards for adults. So there's a childish version of Christianity, which Jesus is saying, come to me, and he'll be loving and wonderful to kids, little children. But with adults, he's going to actually start giving you principles that teach you to be conscious of your sin and grow in obedience and love of God. I think that's what he's saying. And that's why he's saying a childish view of Christianity is ludicrous. And trying to put yourself into the box of being a child in the message of Christ is a wrong idea. Okay, he says we leave out the strenuous passages in the New Testament. We hush them up and we arrange things on an easier and cheaper terms. He says, of every word Christ spoke pointing toward the cost and suffering of being a Christian, we say this does not apply to us. This was spoken expressly to disciples. So we say, oh, well, the 12 were told it's going to be really tough for them, but we got it easy. We make good, however, every word of consolation. So any word of consolation we quote, every promise we quote to ourselves, whether Christ spoke to the apostles or not makes no difference to us. Okay. Now I just want to pause one more time here. Okay, so now we've come to the last slide, basically, in just this section I want to read to you. So this is going to show you how brilliant are the scholars? Are they able to read any of this stuff and figure it out? Where will they end up? So I've told you already, the Paulinists have captured his books. They're editing it. They put in Paul sites everywhere. They basically are trying to suppress what he really means, but it's still there. They can't get rid of the text itself, but whatever. One has to think Kierkegaard would laugh if he could read what some scholars have said about his reverence and trust in the authority of Paul, which we're going to show you in a second. These writers, and this is what I mean, is the reason Gray may come to his opinion that there's some sentences out there that overbalance or counterbalance the terrible statements he made about Paul and Paulinism. But I think what it is they just repeat their own little team. Their team get a hold of of Kierkegaard. They then say things that aren't true, and then that gets picked up by other Paulinists who read somebody saying something that Kierkegaard said and try to amplify what isn't really that positive about Paul, but then they're going to amplify it. So they basically by commentary change a work that's anti-Pauline into a book that's neutral. That's all they care. That's all they care about. So this is why the Paulinists have grabbed hold of Kierkegaard's works. Is they're trying to neutralize him so he doesn't have any impact. And unfortunately, that may be what's happened. So that's why I'm highlighting the negative, so you can see that impact has to be stripped away, and they have to be stopped. These people, despite their taking control of his works. So let's keep reading. These writers have downplayed in the extreme that Kierkegaard stood in opposition to all Paul's main ideas on faith alone and his supposed authority as an apostle, placing these points in discreet yet unmistakable places in his writings. Here is an example of a scholar who twisted entirely around to represent the opposite of Kierkegaard's point about Paul. So listen to this. Kierkegaard is rather consistent in his treatment of Paul throughout his corpus, affirming his status as an apostle. Did you get that idea, ladies and gentlemen? That he thought he was an apostle, the guy who turned it all upside down and took away, robbed from Christ Christianity? I don't think so. If he was an apostle, he'd be the apostle for the enemy. But anyway, I digress. Emphasizing his call to action rather than on a more Lutheran focus on Paul's assurance of grace, and ascribing a sense of divine authority to both Paul's life and writings. Oh, come on. What planet are these people on? But maybe there's something I'm not seeing. I've read a lot of him, and I've read all these works trying to find more quotes. He speaks on so many topics. Paulinism or anti-Paulinism is just one of many things he talks about. So you learn so much reading him. So I've read a lot more just to see what else he talks about. But none of it is talking about Paul's divine authority. This is crazy. But anyway, this is what Laurie Ungerbrandt claims. So I'd love to hear how this is. Paul, Herald of Grace and Paradigm of Christian Living. And Lee Barrett, Kierkegaard in the Bible, Great Britain, 2010. I mean, let's just see. I can't get in there. It's just stunning. But it's Team Paul, and that's all that matters to them. So as long as Paul doesn't get hurt by Kierkegaard, it's okay. But this makes no sense to me. I've read you. How can you reconcile? Let's just look. Let's go back. Let's remember. That's why I quoted these things right at the beginning. So you could say, can anyone say it is of great importance, especially in Protestantism, to correct the enormous confusion Luther caused by inverting the relation and actually criticizing Christ by means of Paul, the master, by means of a follower? Protestantism is altogether untenable. This revolution brought on by proclaiming the Apostle Paul, and he puts it in. See, when you do that, by the way, that means it's, air quotes. It means you don't really believe he's an apostle. That's kind of a standard technique and language. At the expense of the Master Christ, if there's any question of retaining Protestantism, we must confess that this teaching is a mitigation of Christianity, which we have put up with, basically, blah, blah, blah. Let's just see. Did we miss something? The Apostle Paul has still some selfish urge for alleviation, acquiring adherents, become many, something the God-man does not have to do. He does not selfishly crave adherents. I mean, that doesn't sound positive about Paul. Paul made Christianity the Christianity of Paul, not of Christ. Does that sound positive about Paul? I mean, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? I just can't see it. I just don't see it. Let's see, anything else. What I have done is hold up Christ's preaching alongside the preaching of the apostles. So that's the most you can say. He's saying, but he's also saying in context, I won't preach the apostle without preaching Jesus. And he says, if in the teaching of the Apostle Paul there is found even in the slightest degree anything that can be related to what in the course of centuries has become the sophistic which consumes all Christianity, I will raise an outcry. So he's telling you, I'll tell you what Paul teaches, but if I see anything sophistic in there, I'm going to raise an outcry, which means he knows there are things sophistic, meaning crafty, deceitful arguments. Okay, so that's not a positive. The only thing I can come away with is that they're not reading the same things I am. And then fear and trembling. He just says in passing, Paul is without authority. And he says it several times, repeatedly. In fact, that's what this person says here. This Kierkegaard.org book on Adler, and it says Kierkegaard emphatically and repeatedly said that he, Paul, was without authority. So we could go there, but again, it's like I could read that to you, and it's just like it doesn't prove it to me. It just tells me his attitude is negative about Paul. So I could quote it, I could show it to you, but it wouldn't persuade you that that's true or not true. It just tells you Kierkegaard thinks Paul has no authority. So is it true? Let's go back down to. So now let's reread what we read here. Kierkegaard is rather consistent in his treatment of Paul throughout his corpus, affirming his status as an apostle. Well, I will say he did in one of those say he was an apostle, but he wasn't very nice, generally speaking. And then he said he's without authority in other works. In Fear and Trembling is one of his famous books or treatises, short writings, emphasizing his call to action, Paul's call to action, and ascribing a sense of divine authority to both Paul's life and writings. That just doesn't match anything I'm reading. Nope. So this is what you end up getting. You end up getting biased, ill-informed, or ignorant, or maybe completely deceitful. I don't know who Lori Ungerbrandt is, so I can't say that she's being deceitful. But you have to wonder: did she read enough of him to say these things? Or did she have a way of explaining them away? Did he go through a process where he renounced everything? That's not what I've read. I've read most of his corpus. I can't say I've read everything he's ever written, but I don't see anything that would ever suggest he changed his point of view. So anyway, that's the gist of it. So I'm gonna sign off now. I hope this was helpful. And that's Kierkegaard. And so he's a real hero because he stood up and he punched hard against Paulinism. Totally. Thank God. All right, everybody. Take care. Good night. Ciao. Bye.